Last week, I survived my first cyclone, and it grabbed my attention, not just because, well, it was a bloody cyclone, but because for a few years now, I've been part of a wonderful research team at Townsville who are working with local governments and businesses to help them better prepare for these types of disaster events. And I want to talk about my experience with the cyclone because I think some interesting things happened in relation to storytelling and psychology. Here in Queensland, Australia, cyclones are part of the social and historical landscape because we have a lot of them and stories about them are embedded into the local culture. But they tend to feature more in the stories coming out of white settler culture than First Nations culture. And that might be as a result of how white settlers, when they arrived in Australia in 1788, were pretty unprepared for cyclones. It wasn't until around the 1850s that Western scientists started to understand cyclones, and not until the mid-1950s before they started to really understand their fuller complexity. And it wasn't until 1985 that new building codes came in to make buildings somewhat cyclone-proof. So in understanding cyclones in Australia, white settlers have got less than 250 years of direct experience to draw upon. First Nations people have over 65,000 years of experience of cyclones to draw upon. And this is why it makes sense why cyclones feature more in modern white settler storytelling, because stories are created mostly as a way to share and make sense of experiences that are difficult to understand and give people a sense of not being alone in having those experiences. And those experiences are relatively newer for white settlers, and so they're more actively working through this in their storytelling. That element of bringing people closer together is an important way people get through disaster events. Actually, it's a really important thing to do, to get through such events. And storytelling helps people to do that, to come together. And cyclones are difficult to understand because people's experience of cyclones is a product of the complex and symbiotic relationships that exist between people and the places they live. Now, Western culture, which white settlers brought with them into Australia, has largely unprepared us for understanding such things. Western culture has, over the last 2,000 years, developed a way of making sense of the world that has, until recently, conceptually separated people from place and rendered a simplistic relationship between them, an instrumental one, a unidirectional one, rather than a symbiotic one. People work the land to get food and resources from it, and they don't have to worry about giving anything much back in return. That's the knowledge system that gave the green light to the exploitation of natural resources and is the root of the causes of climate change. You know, the belief you can extract what you want and not worry about the consequences. And it's a knowledge system that has largely reduced complex relationships into simple cause and effect ones, and has promoted a reliance on predictability and probability as the main indicators of truth. And all of these things combined have not really set us up awfully well to make sense of the complex systems like cyclones. Now, let's get back to the way we tell stories about cyclones. Cyclones figure in stories in two forms. The first is factual and historical. These are the stories of people living through cyclones. The second form is fictional and metaphorical. Here, cyclones are written into the shape or aesthetic of a story. And the two forms often combine. I want to focus on that second form. The shape of the cyclone can be found in what's often called the three-act structure. Act 1 is called the setup. Here life is normal, but there's a sense of something not quite right. Something is coming, something unsettling or destructive is coming towards us. Then comes Act 2. Act 2 is called the conflict or disruption. Here, that disruptive thing arrives and destruction ensues and all seems lost. But amidst it all, and about halfway through Act 2, we get a moment of clarity. We have our epiphany, a turning point. We realise what it is we need to do. And then comes the third and final act, Act 3, which is called the resolution. Here we come through the disruption and destruction. Things begin to settle back down and we realise there's been a transformation and we build back a new normal. So many of our mainstream stories in Western culture are constructed like that. It pretty much describes the structure of all mainstream Hollywood movies, and our way of talking about our experience of cyclones is often fitted into this 3-act structure. And in case you haven't guessed it, that epiphany in the middle of Act 2, well, that's where the eye of the cyclone passes over. You know, that's where that bit fits in. Now, Cyclone Kirrily hit Townsville on January 25th, with the eye passing over us at around 10 p.m. Earlier in the day, it had been predicted to be a severe Category 3 system, but it slowed down to a Category 2 just before it hit us, even though it ended up as not a severe tropical cyclone. It still caused damage. We had lots of trees knocked over. There was some mostly minor damage to some buildings, but the major damage was done to the electricity network, with over 60,000 households losing power. As cyclones go, Kirrily was pretty tame. It was what here in Australia they refer to as a bit of a fizzer. It didn't come to much, but it did a lot of damage later on, and as I'm recording this video, over a week has passed since the cyclone passed over Townsville, but the now ex-tropical Kirrily is continuing to do a lot of damage, because when it went inland as a tropical low system, it dumped huge amounts of rain, causing massive flooding, and that's been going on for days and days and days. But when it hit us here in Townsville, it just faffed around a bit. It was unpredictable. That's not unusual for cyclones. Cyclones are very unpredictable because they're part of a very complicated weather system. But this one seemed to be particularly unpredictable. It didn't act in the way people expected. It changed direction a lot. It changed shape a lot, changed severity a lot. And all of this was happening as it crossed over us. And this erratic nature of Cyclone Kirrily brought to the fore, perhaps more than is usual, a couple of interesting things. First, information about the cyclone was conflicting and confusing. And second, there were few points of common experience for people who were directly experiencing it. Now, I was, as were most people, sheltering in place in my house when the cyclone arrived. And it arrived at night time, so even though I'm a psychologist, I wasn't running around the streets asking people how they were feeling. You know, psychologists respond to a crisis by running around asking people how they're feeling. No, I didn't do that. I tuned into my local radio station and listened to the people phoning in. Everyone who phoned in seemed to be coping reasonably well. No one was freaking out. But apart from that, people were actually describing very different experiences. Cyclone Kirrily wasn't bringing people together through a shared experience because everyone was having a different experience. The biggest impact of Cyclone Kirrily on Townsville was the power going out. But people's experience here differed widely. Some people lost their power before the cyclone even arrived because of some non-cyclonic related faults in the power system, which is really bad luck. Some people lost their power as the cyclone landed. Others lost their power just after the eye of the cyclone had passed. Some people didn't lose their power at all. The differences didn't stop there. As the cyclone came over, some people experienced howling winds. Others reported little more than a breeze. Some reported a huge downpouring of rain, and others reported hardly any rain at all. And these were people living geographically quite close to each other. You know, Townsville is quite a small city. It was all very odd. Apparently, what had happened was that when the cyclone crossed over Townsville, it shifted direction and shape and then began to quite quickly lose strength. And those three things combined with how it wasn't a very large cyclone in terms of area it spanned meant that there was such a varied experience of it across a relatively small geographical area. And that meant the information coming out about the cyclone was inconsistent and sometimes contradictory. There were conflicting reports of where it was and how strong it was and where it was heading and even where it had been. This is not that unusual for a cyclone, but people did latch on to how erratic Cyclone Kirrily was. It became a focus of conversation during and after it had passed. So the conflicting and confusing information about the cyclone and the way people had very different experiences of it meant people had very different stories to tell about it, and that kind of undid that thing that stories are supposed to do, particularly during disaster events, which is bring people together. People's stories had shifted away from what they had in common to what they had that wasn't in common. But there was maybe something else going on, which was even more disruptive. And that was related to how Townsville has a very high level of socioeconomic inequality. I first saw this in 2019 when Townsville went through a terrible flooding event. And this video's gone on for a bit, so I'll tell you more about that in the second part of this video. And I'll talk about how psychology figures in all of this in ways that have not been that helpful. So, if that's all coming up. So if you want to catch that, remember to hit subscribe if you haven't yet subscribed. That really helps my channel. And click the little notification bell so you get you get pinged when the video gets posted. So, till next time. Ta-da.